You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. Once again, 2019 is upon us, and we have an exciting year ahead in the Hazard Ground Podcast, and we just hope you guys stay with us throughout the entire year, as you guys have done so much. It's been an amazing run so far for this podcast, coming up on our 2-year anniversary here in a couple of weeks. So we plan to have some big things going on this year, and our 100th episode is up and coming, so stay tuned for all that. Once again, remind you guys to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Hazard Ground Podcast. Also, go to our website, hazardground.com, check out the sponsors page, click that tab, support all of the sponsors on the Hazard Ground Podcast, because they are the ones that help keep this podcast coming, keep the guests coming in, and have gotten us so much positive reviews on the work that we're doing here, not only within the veteran community, but beyond as well. Leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That stuff is so important. The more ratings and reviews we get, the bigger the show grows, the bigger guests we get, and of course, the more the Hazard Ground community grows and helping support veterans everywhere. All that said, once again, we'd just like to thank you guys, the listeners, for joining us each and every week. You guys are such a big part of what we do. We love the feedback. We love hearing from you guys, and we also love the support that you give to the Hazard Ground Podcast and the Hazard Ground community. Enough of me talking, guys. Let's get on to this week's episode. Joining us this week is a retired Air Force 4-star general. He is the former 14th Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and as a pilot in Vietnam, he earned the Silver Star and 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. He was also an integral part of the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. He is General Retired Merrill McPeak here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. General, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mark. Delighted to be here with you.
An incredible career, sir. Just unreal to have achieved that height. And again, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, it's like, wow, there's only a select few people who ever put that title next to their name in the military. So certainly congratulations on an amazing career. But I'm very curious to hear about your experience in Vietnam and what you did to be so decorated. But we always like to start back at the beginning and tell us how you got into the Air Force.
Well, I was an ROTC cadet at San Diego State College. I graduated there in the late 50s, but following the Korean War, ROTC was more or less, mandatory at the state colleges, and so I entered. In any case, I was a scholarship kid there and needed the money, and ROTC paid $1 a day. So every 3 months I got a check for $90, and that was a godsend in those days to me. So yeah, I came through the ROTC and had no intention of making a career out of the Air Force. I thought I'd get in and out, but my first assignment was to flying training, and I absolutely fell in love with flying. And and one thing led to another. The Air Force kept giving me interesting work to do, and I ended up 37 years later retiring.
Yeah, it works out that way. Why the Air Force as opposed to the Army or anything else?
The only ROTC we had at San Diego State was Air Force.
Ah, okay.
So you could go with the Navy or with the Marines, but it was not at the school. You had to drive across town to do it, that kind of thing. And I don't know where the nearest Army ROTC was, but anyway, the Air Force was there and paraded every Thursday, and so I joined up.
You mentioned the Korean War and you signed up after. Did you think at any point in time that you were going to have to serve in combat when you were going through ROTC? You kind of just figured that this was the kind of downtime in the world politic arena?
I didn't really think about it. To tell you the truth, I had, when I graduated, to go to flying school, you had to sign a contract with the Air Force to stay for 3 years. So that was my commitment. In fact, I was a distinguished graduate, what they called, of ROTC, so they offered me a regular commission, just like the ones they were giving then to academy graduates. And I turned it down, said no, give it to somebody who wants to make the service a career. Then when I went to flying training, I was a distinguished graduate of pilot training, and they offered it to me again. And that time I took it because flying had become something sort of, like addictive to me. So, and it didn't really make any difference. You could be either regular or reserve on active duty, and it made no real difference. But I accepted a regular commission, and therefore, at a pretty early moment, as a lieutenant, I entered the regular Air Force.
And what was that like for you? Was that culture shock, lifestyle-wise?
No, I was in a fighter squadron when it caught up with me. I graduated, as I say, I was a distinguished graduate. In those days, there weren't very many fighter assignments coming out of flying training. I think we had 40 guys in my class and 6 fighter jobs. The rest went to SAC, B-47s or KC-135s, chopper guys, something like that. So you had to be very high in your class. I think the 6 fighter jobs went to the top 6 guys in my class. So I then was offered a regular commission, accepted it, and by the time the paperwork caught up with me, I was in my first squadron, an F-104 squadron out in Southern California, and it didn't make any difference. I mean, I went from reserve to regular, and all it was a change in my personnel file somewhere.
Sure.
I just continued flying fighter sorties in the F-104 every day. No difference.
So what year is this? I'm just trying to put it in reference to Vietnam when it starts.
Yeah, I got my wings in January of 1959. So
okay.
That's when I graduated. The same day that Fidel Castro walked into Havana, Cuba, and kicked out the Batista government. So that happened on the same day.
So, I mean, take me through this. You have to be about, what, 21, 22, 23 years old at this point in time?
Yeah, 22 maybe.
Okay. And so 1960 comes, Kennedy gets elected. I don't want to give everybody a history lesson, but we all know what the next 2 or 3 years led to at almost the height of the Cold War. We're going through Bay of Pigs. We're going through the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is happening during your military career as this stuff is starting to unfold?
Well, it was interesting because we flew at a pretty high sortie rate in those years. I think 20 hours a month was kind of the standard in a fighter squadron. That's maybe 14, 15 sorties a month. So you flew, and there were only 21 duty days a month, so you flew just about every day. But I can remember when the U-2 was shot down.
Right.
In Russia, this was when Eisenhower was still president, Gary Powers.
1952, right?
Yeah, and
okay.
We started flying more.
Wow.
And I can remember very much the Cuban Missile Crisis. And
were you guys on like the highest of alert then? I mean, was everybody like standing by waiting to get in an aircraft to go somewhere?
Well, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I had been reassigned. I was in the UK in an F-100 squadron pulling what we call Victor Alert, which was with a nuclear weapon aboard the aircraft.
Oh, wow.
And I was sitting there watching BBC on alert when Kennedy made that speech in Chicago, looking very haggard. In fact, it turned out now we know he was ill at the time, had influenza or something. But so I was sitting there watching him talk about imposing a quarantine, blockade around Cuba. There were at that moment Russian boats headed for Cuba with more armaments. And I, quietly got up and went back to the safe and got out my target folder. My target at the time was Peenemünde in eastern Germany, which had a fighter regiment on it, 50 MiGs, East German Air Force. And, I went back and did a little target study because it looked dead serious to me. But during the earlier Cuban problems, I was at George, and we did increase our sortie rate. So we took seriously these major events in the Cold War, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was quite personal to me since I was sitting alert at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that daily life of not knowing what's next. I mean, look, in my lifetime, sir, wars start because of some major impactful event, right? There's not like a lot of lead up and build up to it. It's as we go, it's Pearl Harbor, it's 9/11, these things are catalysts for war. But during that time, there was periods of weeks and months that any day this thing was a powder keg ready to explode. So, every day getting out of bed, you didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah, it's really true. And of course, for fighter crews in Europe, where I was during those years, 63, 4, 5, until I joined the Thunderbirds. I came back and got involved flying air shows with the Thunderbirds in 67 and 68. But anyway, in those years, you spend a lot of time on alert. I mean, you just disappear behind a fence, and your family, my family was there in the UK with me, but you'd go on alert and stay there for 3, 4, 5 days, come out, and then you'd be off for a couple of weeks. So it was a more or less constant hair trigger situation on both sides. I don't know how they did it on the Soviet side, but on our side, we were ready to go. I mean, we're supposed to launch, be off the ground, airborne, gear up with a nuclear weapon carried center line in 15 minutes from sleeping, a cold start in bed in the alert facility. So,
wow.
Yeah, there was that kind of continuous pressure. Now, you say wars start with a precipitous event. Well, Vietnam didn't.
Right, yeah.
So there was a very long buildup to our involvement in Vietnam, and during some of that time, I was flying solo pilot with the Thunderbird, and worried that I wasn't going to get to the war, that the war would be over before I got there.
It's so funny, So we talked to so many people on the podcast, and they even said this about the global war on terror. Like, everyone's like, we thought it was going to be over. We were afraid it was going to be over. And here we sit, nearly 20 years later in the global war on terror in Vietnam, technically from start to finish was about 20 years. It's like, everybody's going to get their turn. There's no reason to rush to this thing. But that said, so, Vietnam, we had advisors there in the mid-50s into the late 50s. And then, once Kennedy takes hold of becomes president, that's when he starts to kind of raise things. At what point in time do you shift to start to move to Southeast Asia?
Well, I think the key events, first of all, regarding Kennedy's involvement, I think he was very much, he loved the special forces. The Green Berets were his kind of guy. And so the involvement from a standpoint of special operations, training, being on the ground to help the South Vietnamese armed forces, logistics support, intelligence support, I think he was all in on that. But it was really Johnson that made the initial
big escalation
of ground forces regular. The first units were Marine Battalion, I think, landed up at Da Nang, but very shortly after we had, regular combat forces in there in 67, 68. And of course, we had Tet came along in January 68. That was a sort of a highlight of the war. Now, I was flying air shows at the time, and so I didn't get to Vietnam until the end of 68. I actually flew my first combat sortie on Boxing Day, December 26th, and my last air show in November of 68. So to get the family resettled and to go to jungle survival training and to get requalified in all the munitions events and so on, and to get there. And then when you get there, you got to spend 3 or 4 days going through the ground indoctrination and so on. So to fly my first sortie on December 26th was very, very, meant I didn't waste any time. I was very anxious to get involved and got there as quick as I could.
So what sort of missions were you flying in Vietnam? Was it just ground cover? Or were these kind of, attack missions? Give me the nature of the work, sir.
Yeah, attack is a good description. It was close air support. I was stationed first at Phu Cat in 3 Corps, which are about on the same parallel with Kon Tum and the Central Highlands. So I started just doing close air support, which you take off, go find a forward air controller, they mark a target. The forward air controller is working with the Army, belongs to the battalion commander that he's working with. They mark a target, you expend munitions, and you go back home and land. So That was the mission that I started in on. By that time I got there, late '68, most of the real fighter pilots had been and gone back. So the squadrons were full of guys who were training command, instructor ex-IPs, or even some transport pilots, C-130 guys who were cross-trained over into fighters because we'd run out of fighter pilots. So guys coming out of the Pentagon, the staff somewhere, or guys like me who had been in a 2-year controlled assignment. I couldn't leave the Thunderbirds. I mean, it's a it's a 6-man air show, and so I couldn't get out of it for the 2 years that I was in it. So by the time I arrived there, they were pretty short of career fighter pilots, and I had been a gunnery instructor, had served in squadrons in both the U.S. and abroad. I had 2 years of flying air shows, which people thought was pretty good training. So I very rapidly became went from being a wingman to being a leader, flight leader, instructor pilot, and by early January I was checking out the new guys when they came in. And then the reason I go through all this is because I moved to a different job out of the close air support business. I was asked to go up and take a leadership role in a squadron called Misty. It didn't really have a number, wasn't a regular squadron, because it was doing highly classified work, classified at the time, not classified any longer, so I can talk about it. But we were flying into Laos, and we were forward air controllers. So I wasn't actually, taking off and finding a FAC and working. I was the FAC. I took off and FAC for people coming over to Laos to try to stop traffic down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that was a change, and was no longer doing really close air support. I was doing interdiction, trying to stop traffic down that trail. And so I took over Misty, first as the number 2 man, the ops officer, and then as a commander, and flew 98 sorties with the Misty FACs, which turned out to be very interesting work, the most interesting work I did over there. And
why was that?
Well, because a lot of the in-country sorties, we called it trees in contact. I mean, that's a bastardization of a term, troops in contact. Now, troops in contact is very interesting work. You're going out and supporting our little green guys on the ground, and they are actually shooting at somebody.
Right.
So that means you're helping, I mean, when it's a real troops in contact situation, everybody wants to go show up and support the Army, do close air support. But mostly what we called it was trees in contact, because we weren't in contact with anybody. The battalion commander was given a certain number of sorties per day, and the FAC put him in on the most interesting trees he could find. There might be somebody under one of those trees, kind of deal.
Sure.
So it was kind of a waste of time. And but going over to Laos and finding traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and stopping it, that was really helpful. I mean, that was, and by the way, you were sort of the guy in charge. I mean, it was one of those, it was a mission type order situation, which is perfect. And nobody down in Saigon was telling you how to do it. The mission was stop traffic. We don't care how you do it. Go over there. If you find traffic, shoot it up, stop it. And that's what we did. And by the way, it was a little more dangerous because there was, it wasn't just small arms fire and automatic weapons over there. Well, like what you had in the South, you had some AAA. And and anybody shot down in Laos was not going to be recovered. I mean, we lost a couple hundred aviators over there, and almost none of them ever came back.
Take me through that for a second, sir, because I'm curious about that. When you talk about the danger of these missions, is dealing with troops in contact and close air support less dangerous necessarily than the idea of just, halting traffic down the Ho Chi Minh Trail or whatever it may be? What's the level of the difference here?
Well, I can't talk about all close air support situations because they're individual.
Right.
I mean, close air support in Korea, for instance, the fire support coordination line was moved back to like 100 meters or something. Our guys were really, when the Chinese intervened in Korea, that made close air support, I think, a different kind of thing than what we did in Vietnam and more dangerous. But in Vietnam, by and large, now a lot of planes were shot down in Vietnam, don't get me wrong. I think the Army lost like 1,000 helicopters during that period. Now the helicopter is a particularly vulnerable target because of its, it's a noisy thing. You're not going to surprise anybody, and it's going pretty slow. So, but we lost a lot of fighters in South Vietnam. So you can't say that it was risk-free to go out and do close air support. But I thought it was pretty easy. I wasn't concerned about the risk in the South. In Laos, I always kept my speed up because there you did have AAA, mostly small caliber stuff when I was there, but 23 millimeter AAA is really a good gun. I think it's a Czech design. Russians manufactured it, but that is a gun. Now, 37, 57 came in later, and I never really saw any 37, 57, but 57 is shot with a 4-round clip. So the gunner drops 4 rounds in, fires them, and then he's done. He has to reload. And you'll see the little puff marks when those shells self-destruct. And if there's 4 of them, it's 57. If it's 5, it's 37 because 37 has a 5-round clip. Now the 23 millimeter gun has got a 50-round can, and usually you're looking at a twin barrel situation. So the guy can fire 100 rounds at you, before he has to put a new can on the gun. That's a pretty dense fire, and so I always considered the 23 millimeter their best AAA gun, and there was a lot of 23 over in Laos. So, the defense against it is you got to go fast. So whenever I saw the airspeed drop below 500 knots, I was right into afterburner. The F-100 would sustain 500 knots low on the deck at full power, what we call full military power. But we were also doing a weave or a jink to continuously to spoil any tracking solution that the gunner has on the ground.
Sure.
And if you jink hard enough, you're going to knock the airspeed down below 500. So basically, I was in and out of afterburner all the time. The sorties over there were 4+ hours long, and that meant you had to go back to the tanker and refuel twice because it was, pretty spendy expenditure of fuel to keep your speed up over there.
Was that too long in your opinion, or no?
It was.
I mean, given the nature of the enemy on the ground and what you were flying up against, was it too long?
No.
Okay.
It wasn't too long. But look, if you get up 2 hours before launch and go down to the squadron and get your intelligence briefing and all the rest of that stuff, and get the airplane, and then at the end of the sortie, you got to go through another 2-hour intelligence briefing. It's an all-day thing to fly one 4.5-hour sortie.
Okay.
And we had a 100 mission limit in Misty, but that's 25 and a 4-month limit. It was considered one of those, first of all, everybody was a volunteer. So we took volunteers from the F-100 wings all over the theater. There was a wing at Da Nang and a wing at Phan Rang and so on, Tui Hua. All those guys they kept 4 pilots up at Phuket from each of those wings. And those guys were specially self-selected. You had to have 100 sorties to get into Misty. And then we were pretty picky about who we took. So we had a special group of guys there. In fact, we just had a reunion out here in Oregon. I got the squadron all together and brought them all out here. Some pretty famous guys. I ended up being the chief of the Air Force. And my successor, Ron Fogelman, the 15th Air Chief, was a Misty. In fact, worked for me when I was commander of the squadron.
Wow.
And, there's just a lot of famous people. Our first commander, Bud Day, got the Medal of Honor. He was shot down, and I spent some time in Hanoi, a long time, 5 or 6 years in Hanoi, and got the Medal of Honor. So it was a famous squadron. Dick Rattan was in it. He's the guy that flew around the world on one tank of gas. His brother, Bert Rattan, designed a Voyager that did that, won the Collier Trophy for a round-the-world flight without landing on one tank of gas. Anyway, so we had a lot of famous guys, very special people who got in that squadron. And it was because that was the way that F-100 pilots could kind of participate in the out-country war. Otherwise, F-100 guys did all the sorties, close air support in country. I said it was a 100 mission limit, and since I was doing the scheduling, I should have got to 100, but we moved the squadron from Phuket down to Tuhiwa at the end of my 4-month period. And so I was at 98 sorties when we got down there, and the guy I went to work for fired me. So I only got to 98, which is one of the things that irritates me to this day. There's, it would have been nice to say I flew 100 sorties, but I only got 98. Very few Misties actually got 100 sorties because it's hard to do it in 4 months.
What are some of the most memorable missions that you went on? I'm not asking you to kind of like brag, but I know you're awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice and the Silver Star. I mean, do these missions stick out to you or no?
No. The ones that I got decorated for were kind of routine.
Really?
Yeah. They're, but I can remember a couple of missions I didn't get decorated for. I'll just tell you a couple stories, these kind of war stories, so I apologize about it. But I remember one time we had a gunner on the side of a cliff. We called him the Gutsy Gunner. He had to be a Laotian, Pathet Lao guy, not NDA, because the regular North Vietnamese army was highly disciplined. And they would only shoot at you if you were going after a target that they were supposed to defend. Otherwise, they kept guns tight over there. But this guy, so I think this guy was Pathet Lao because he shot every time. And he thought he was pretty well camouflaged where he was on the side of a cliffside, his gun position. But if you flew at that cliff, there was a stratum of rock that looked like a little finger, and it pointed right at him. He was right at the end. He was kind of where the fingernail would be on that rock. Now, he didn't have 23 millimeter. He had a what we call a zip gun, a ZPU. ZPU is a machine gun, kind of like our 50 caliber. And it can be mounted as a single or a double, or there's even a quad configuration where you put 4 barrels in a square shape. And so when we got a new Mystic pilot in the squadron, we'd stick him in the back seat of an F-100F, and we'd fly by this cliff and, bank up and look, I'd say, look right at the end of that stratum of rock. And there'd be that gunner firing. And you could see the 4, muzzle flashes of this quad ZPU. And so they were real easy to see. And because he always shot right at us, he never led us. So if you went by him going 500 knots, and he's shooting right at your canopy, that's safe as being in bed because all those bullets are going to be behind you.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew nothing about lead for target motion, and he was a reliable shooter. He just loved to shoot. So we used him as a training aid. we'd roll up and look at the canopy and say, now that's quad ZPU. See that? And the guy say, yeah, that's great. Because most guys you get, they come to you from squadrons in South Vietnam, and they got no experience with heavy, and for us to recognize the caliber of a gun and report it properly when we got back was important. So we had ways of trying to train a guy to say, okay, that's ZPU, that's 23 millimeter, etc. So we left the guy alone. He was a reliable training aid, and we used him. And then one day the weather was just lousy all over Laos, except there was a little, sucker hole, some blue sky right over the top of this guy. So I called, Hillsborough was dumping fighters on me. Hillsborough was the airborne command and control that would make contact with the incoming fighters and then hand them off to you so that you could control them and, put them in on targets. And the weather was bad all over the place, so they had lots of fighters with munitions that they didn't, all the rest of the targets were closed. So I said, okay, send them on over here. And so I said, I felt sorry about it because we were going to lose my training aid here, but he happened to be located right, the only place where the weather was good. So I marked him, and we started bombing the guy. And we must have put, 3 or 4 4-ship flights in on this guy, some of them with 2,000-pound bombs.
Wow.
So there's no doubt that this guy, who thought we was sitting there fat, dumb, and happy for months on the trail, and got no activity, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. I marked that guy with marking rockets, 2.75 folding fin rockets, white phosphorus warhead in the nose. I must have marked him 10, 12 times. He shot at me every time I marked him. At the end of the day, when I was all done, I flew by, and he shot at me again. We never got that guy. I mean, that our bombing was not that accurate. I mean, our average miss distance in Vietnam for all bombs dropped was probably 300 meters.
Really?
Which was the reason why we went to work on precision-guided munitions.
Yeah.
The Vietnam generation brought you stealth because of the losses up around Hanoi, running against radars. It brought you precision-guided munitions, and it brought you night capability, which we didn't have before. All of us came back from that war and went to work on what we knew we needed to correct, and we corrected it. I mean, I was chief during Desert Storm, and we saw the beginning. I mean, only less than 10% of the munitions dropped during Desert Storm were guided, but they are the ones that did the heavy lifting, and we all saw that. So, and we used the F-117, first stealth fighter in Desert Storm, and we operated at night. We kicked the operation off at night, 2 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And all of those were lessons learned from Vietnam for us. So we came back, and my generation fixed. Anyway, so this guy was gone the next day because I went up the next day and looked, and he didn't shoot at me. So he moved. He knew he'd been found out. But I always thought we should give that guy a medal. He's the guy that should get the Distinguished Flying Cross because he was a perfect training aid for us, and he was a gutsy guy. He always shot. He just needed a little training about how to do the shooting. The problem with a guy like that is if you're marketing, in other words, you roll in, point the nose at him, you fire a Willie Pete marking rocket at him, he doesn't have to solve the lead for target motion problem anymore because you're nose on, headed right at him. So the marking guns is a thing I never really enjoyed very much because you got to roll in, track the target just momentarily, fire the rocket, and quickly brake left or right because you solved his problem if you stay nose on to him very long. And so marking even that guy, who wasn't very skillful, 6 or 7 times, was interesting work. And anyway, luckily, the only time I ever got hit was over in Laos, and it wasn't with machine gun like a zip; it was small arms fire. So anyway, that guy I got a lot of enormous respect for. We missed him after that. The guy, we'd gotten used to having him around.
Interesting stuff, sir, to say the least. Let's kind of fast forward towards the end of Vietnam when the whole thing ends and you're done. I guess twofold question. Do you know what's next for you for your career? But also more of a, when everybody returned home, I asked this of a lot of Vietnam vets, how did you feel about the way you guys were treated upon coming home?
Well, I was treated very well. I've heard a lot of stories about bad treatment. In fact, I don't know if you saw the Ken Burns.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in that, and I was a technical advisor to him. And I was in 4 of the 10. I personally appeared in 4 of the 10 episodes. But and there's some things in there from veterans saying how badly they were treated when they got back and so forth. It never happened to me. Maybe I was running with the wrong crowd. I don't know. But I was treated very well. When I got back, I went to the staff college, the Armed Forces Staff College in Norfolk. And so that was a nice break after the war. And then I went to the Pentagon for 3 years. And I was treated very well everywhere I went. After that, I was stationed in New York City itself, downtown, at the Council on Foreign Relations for an academic year. And I sometimes had to wear my uniform on the subway. I rode the subway from where I lived to the Council's headquarters in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I'll tell you, people would, when I had my uniform on, people would get out of the way and smile at me. And these are New Yorkers. I mean, it's supposed to be, the bastion of anti-war liberalism, but people were very respectful and very nice to me. So I had a positive experience. Now, we didn't have any victory parades after Vietnam, but, if you're going to have a victory parade, you got to begin by having a victory. And we lost Vietnam. We never lost a battle in Vietnam. We acquitted ourselves well when we were there, or reasonably well, for a long time. I mean, towards the end, there was some fragging of officers and NCOs and some dope use and some race problems and so on with the Army. But in general, we weren't defeated militarily. We just lost the war because the politics of it was wrong.
Sure.
One was tempted to say almost corrupt. Certainly they were corrupt in Saigon. But I also thought that our Washington leadership pretty much kidded itself, especially Johnson and Nixon, and allowed a lot of dead bodies to pile up instead of just admitting, okay, guys, we screwed it up. We made a mistake. Let's get out of here, which in my judgment is what should have happened years before it did. It finally did happen. I mean, essentially, we had a fig leaf, of leaving with our head held high, but we knew, and everybody knew, that Saigon's days were numbered as soon as we left, we left the theater.
So, where does your career go from here? I mean, you leave Vietnam as a major, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what's next? And I mean, at what point in time do you realize that, like, hey, I'm going to be a general one day?
Well, I never thought I was going to be a general. I mean, certainly not for a very long time. I went to the Pentagon and got promoted twice in below the zone to lieutenant colonel and to colonel. In fact, I was wearing my silver lieutenant colonel fleets for 4 months when I came out on the colonel list.
Wow.
That's the reason, I got handed a hot potato in the Pentagon, and so I spent a lot of time in front of the chief of staff and senior officers, and I guess I didn't screw it up. So I got promoted too quickly, really, because I should have spent a little more time as a lieutenant colonel, including hopefully, command of a regular squadron,
right,
which I never had. I had command of that Misty outfit, but it wasn't a regular squadron. Anyway, so then they didn't know what to do with me, and I spent 8 years as a colonel with 8 different PCS assignments, and none of them very good until I got to the last one, which was to command a fighter wing in NATO. Again, with a nuclear weapons, Victor Alert mission. And once I got that wing commander job, that gave me a shot at being general, because wing commanders are a rich source of general officer material.
Right.
But until I got that wing, I had some pretty bad jobs as a colonel. I mean, really bad, including spending 9 months at the Council on Foreign Relations after having graduated from the National War College. So that's kind of 2 tours of scholarship, which nobody needs if they're going to be a general, or that's the way I felt about it. So yeah, I eventually got a good job, which was running the 20th Fighter Wing, and I got to keep it for 16 months, which is not long enough, because I got promoted to 1-star, and then they made me leave.
They really like you in the Air Force, huh?
No, right. Yeah.
So, okay, how does the process go for being named Chief of the Air Force?
Well, the Secretary of the Air Force talks to the Chief of Staff, and they decide what, we had at the time, we had 12 4-star generals in the Air Force. That was our quota. And those 12 guys, you'd say, there's probably half of them are getting ready to retire. So, I mean, that's the pool from which you're going to pick your chief as those 4-star generals. And the chief will sit down with the secretary, at least in my experience. I mean, it can be done a lot of different ways, I expect. And they talk about who these guys are and who's young enough to serve another 4 years, and what their experience has been, and what you think their leadership qualities are, and so forth. And they make a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense, and that goes to the president. Now, in my case, there were a couple of us out of the 12 that were sort of finalists. Mike Dugan and I. Dugan and I had known each other for a long time. In fact, had been in squadron over in the NATO together as lieutenants. And the secretary came and interviewed me, went over to Europe. I was in command in the Pacific, and Mike Dugan was in command in Europe. The secretary himself came, spent the night with us, had dinner, blah, blah, and went back, and Mike was nominated to be chief, Mike Dugan. So I lost in that contest. And Mike took over in summer of 1990. And almost immediately, Kuwait was invaded by Saddam Hussein, and Desert Shield started, which was our reinforcement of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And towards the fall, sometime after Mike had been chief for a couple months, he flew over there to look at how it was going. Our Air Force was filing, sending squadrons in every day. And on the way back, he had an interview on the airplane with some reporters and said some things that he later wished he hadn't said. This was going to be an air operation from beginning to end. We were going to win it. We were going to kill Saddam Hussein while he was sleeping, and his mistress with him, and stuff like that. sort of fighter pilot talk. I agreed with all of it, by the way. But anyway, when he got back, Colin Powell, who was chairman, was livid. Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, was very angry. They called Mike in Monday morning and fired him.
Oh, man.
And since I had just come in second, they needed an air chief right away. I mean, we were building up for war. Mike called me out in Honolulu, where my headquarters was, and said, "Better pack your DOP kit and get on in here." So I actually was named chief, I think, without a lot of competition, because we had just had a competition, So I became the 14th chief in November of '90, and of course, there's still a couple months to go before Desert Storm broke out in January.
I assume you weren't rushing to do any interviews at that point in time.
I kept my head down, but I had a good. I went over to Saudi and flew 7 sorties. I was still current in the F-15. I'd been flying the F-15 out in Hawaii.
So wait, you're the chief of the Air Force and flying missions in Desert Storm?
No. I went over to Saudi and I flew 7 sorties in the F-15
Okay.
before. No, I had to be in the Pentagon when it started.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think it started on the 23rd of January or something. So I was back by the 17th and or so. And in fact, George H.W. Bush called me over to the Pentagon, and I had lunch with him and Cheney after I got back from Saudi Arabia, and George H.W. Bush wanted to. He said, "I hear you've been over there flying airplanes." Of course, he was a fighter pilot himself, and so I said, "Yeah." He said, "What's going on? How are we doing? We're ready to go." And at that time, there was just 4 of us at this lunch in the White House. There was Cheney, the president, Brent Scowcroft, who was his national security advisor, and me. And so at the time, we had already delayed the kickoff of Desert Storm. And Colin Powell and others wanted to delay it some more because the Army wasn't quite ready to go. It takes a while for them to get in shape. I didn't care. I said, let us start. I mean, the 8th Air Force in England in World War II didn't wait until D-Day to start bombing Germany, right? So
that's a good point.
So we could start bombing anytime we wanted. But the Army was in love with this idea of synchronized, action, synchronization, whatever the hell that means.
Yeah, that's one of our key terms there, sir. We love synchronization.
Well, okay, when you're ready, join in. But there's no sense us giving Saddam Hussein a free pass until you guys get ready to synchronize your watches. Okay, so anyway, the president asked me how I felt, and I said, my only worry is we started troops in or sending squadrons in August, and they've been doing wind sprints and push-ups, for 6 months over there. We're ready to go. And, there's no reason why we should delay any longer. Let us get started on this. So he looked at me and he said, "Don't worry," which I thought was great. So we kicked off, a week or so later.
That's amazing.
Air war lasted 39 days, and and then when the Army did join in, it was like what they called the 100-hour war. Yeah, I think that if you asked the Iraqis, they probably thought it lasted a little longer than 100 hours.
So when you think back to that, is that surreal to sit in there and have that kind of conversation with the president? And especially as we record this here on December 4th, he just passed a couple of days ago, George H.W. Bush did. I mean, did those memories come, flooding back to you?
No, although I was invited to come to the Capitol Rotunda whenever they had a bunch of Vietnam guys there, and to his service at the National Cathedral. And I can't. I live out in Oregon now, and I'm in business out here, so I had to turn down those invitations. I will tell you this about George H.W. Bush. He was a wonderful guy, really, really good man. And I thought a world-class, commander-in-chief. So when I think about, and Barbara, I like Barbara Bush a lot. That day when I had lunch with him after coming back from Vietnam, I hadn't met the First Lady because, my hiring was a little different. I imagine when you're nominated to be a chief of staff, you go over and meet the president before he sends your nomination over to the Senate. I didn't do that. So I met the president that day for the first time, and he said, "Hey, you've never met Barbara Bush?" I said, "No." So she had they'd been up to Camp David, and she had fallen down on an icy sidewalk or something up there. Hadn't broken her leg, but it hurt her, and her leg was in a cast. So anyway, he takes me into their bedroom. I'm saying to myself, nobody is ever going to believe this. He takes me into the bedroom. She's in her PJs, still in bed, pajamas, and her legs sticking out with the cast on it. And that's the way I meet the First Lady of the United States.
That is unreal.
The president walks me into their bedroom and introduces me to Barbara Bush. But it was just natural. I mean, he had no pretense. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was a real man, a gentle man. Not some braggart who invents crises so he can ride to the rescue, or some of the other manifestations of the loss of dignity that we see in the White House today.
That's incredible. Let me ask you about the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. You touched on it before as you were an integral part of it. How did you feel like that documentary, did justice, or did you feel like it did justice to what went on in Vietnam and the people who were there, and did it really hit the right notes for you?
Yes. I think it's great work, or I wouldn't have stayed involved. I worked on it for 5 years.
Oh, wow.
And I've been with Ken a lot in his place up in New Hampshire and all over the place, in the editing room, time, hours. I must have seen the thing 10 times. And we formed a group called the War Room, where we had a range of political opinions in there. We had a guy who was a leader in the protest movement against the war, Fred Zimmerman. We had Carl Morlantis, who won the Navy Cross and wrote the book Matterhorn, and others. So we would sit around and try to shoot holes in this thing and try to pick it apart from the standpoint of who's going to criticize this. And by the way, it has been criticized quite a bit from both the left and the right. There's the people on the right who say we coulda, woulda, shoulda won. It was Walter Cronkite that betrayed us. If we just hung in there, blah, 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 we could have won. Then there's a criticism from the left that says, hey, the anti-war movement was right all along, and you guys should have listened to it. And you finally did, but look at you stacked up 60,000 people names on a wall in Washington. So there's a range of views there, and I thought the documentary just told a story, good, bad, and indifferent, and a lot of it's bad, but they told it truthfully, and it's the first time, by the way, we ever got interviews from the other side. Here you're interviewing a guy who was a senior Viet Cong guy,
right,
or a Politburo member in Hanoi. We never saw the war through the eyes of the other guy in the way that you see it in that documentary. So anyway, I think it's a timeless document. It will be looked at 100 years from now as a pretty good rendering of the history. And since I don't think young people read as much of their printed word as they used to,
That's correct.
They get their history through video. That documentary is going to have an enormous and lasting impact in my judgment.
Well, sir, again, just a phenomenal career. What you have done and accomplished is nothing short of spectacular, and certainly you've helped shape and mold not only the Air Force but the military for the future, and we can't thank you enough for that. But just amazing to hear your story and understand what you've gone through and where you've been, and how you kind of just seem to take it all in stride as you've gone through 37 plus years as a member of the Air Force. But certainly thank you for your time, and we certainly appreciate you joining us.
Okay, Mark. Nice talking to you, buddy.
General McPeak, thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Okay, cheerio.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.